Hello everybody, and welcome. I'm Kate Saunders from the International Campaign for Tibet, and I'll be moderating and speaking at this event. And I'd just like to express my gratitude to Fritt for hosting this event, particularly Bente, and I'm feeling very privileged and delighted to be here in Oslo and to speak about the Tibet issue. Also like to thank Oystein from the Voice of Tibet too for all his work in helping to make this happen. So we have a panel of 4 speakers tonight. We have, first of all, I'm going to speak, and then Namkho, who is a Tibetan from eastern Tibet, from the Naba area, which is where the self-immolations as a form of protest began in February 2009, and where many of the self-immolations have happened, currently under military lockdown, this area. We'll each speak for around 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions and answers. So, and just to introduce Namkho, first of all, Namkho came into exile in 2003, making the very dangerous crossing into exile through Nepal and then India. He was at primary school in Tibet, and he then studied in India at the Tibetan Transit School, which is run by the exile authorities in Dharamsala. And the reason for his leaving Tibet was because, like so many Tibetans inside Tibet who are deprived of the presence of the Dalai Lama, he wanted to see His Holiness. In 2011, Namkho went back to Tibet at great risk to see his family and friends, and he became so overwhelmed by what he saw and the extent of the oppression that he very courageously travelled around Tibet documenting what he saw on video footage. And we're going to show a film now. It's about 15 minutes film. It's made by International Campaign for Tibet. And what we did was we brought together some of Namkho's very powerful footage in order to document the situation. So we'll just show the film, and then we'll go on to talking. Thank you.
21st century China is an emerging global superpower. A new Chinese leadership has just been installed amid wrenching social change in China. But the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party and its rule over Tibet are being challenged as never before. It is a critical moment in Tibet's history. Early one afternoon in February 2009, a young monk called Tabe walked out of his monastery in eastern Tibet and set himself on fire. Since then, 84 more Tibetans across the Tibetan plateau have self-immolated, including a 19-year-old female student, a young mother of 2, and the grandfather of an important reincarnate Lama. This constitutes one of the biggest waves of self-immolation as political protest worldwide in the past 60 years. Lama Söba, a religious teacher in his 40s, said in a final testimony before setting himself ablaze that he was giving his body as an offering of light. The self-immolations in Tibet are a dramatic and visible counter to the claims of the Chinese Communist Party to be improving Tibetan lives. They are a challenge to the Chinese government's legitimacy in Tibet, particularly at the time of a major leadership transition in Beijing. The Chinese government blames the Dalai Lama and so-called outside forces for the self-immolations, but it is acknowledged by a number of Western governments and international institutions, and even some scholars and netizens in China, that these dramatic developments in Tibet reflect a fundamental failure in policy that must be addressed. The Chinese government has responded to the self-immolations by intensifying the military build-up in Tibet and strengthening the very policies and measures that are the root cause of these acts. The crackdown has resulted in a climate of fear that only increases the danger of more self-immolations and unrest. There is a direct correlation between the self-immolations and an intensified campaign against the Dalai Lama. This is combined with an aggressive and systematic expansion of legal measures, tightening state control over Tibetan religion and culture. Since 2008, when protests swept across Tibet, the Chinese authorities have moved from instilling an oppressive environment in monasteries, nunneries, and civil societies to one that can be more accurately characterized as totalitarian. In other words, an approach in which the state recognizes no limits to its authority and strives to regulate every aspect of public and private life. The Chinese authorities have sought to seal off Tibet and impose an information blackout. Penalties for even low-level information sharing are among the worst in the world, and almost any expression of Tibetan identity can be branded as criminal or splittist and penalized by a prison sentence or worse. There is an increasing sense of enforced separation among Tibetans in Tibet from the Dalai Lama. This is due to the acute dangers of expressing loyalty to the exiled leader and the lack of any formal connection between the Dalai Lama and the Chinese authorities following the breakdown of dialogue between them in 2010. Self-immolation as a form of protest is a dramatic and powerful statement, but it does not involve the death of others. Despite facing oppression, dispossession, and policies that undermine Tibetan religion, culture, and livelihoods over the past half-century, in the main, Tibetans have not turned to violence. This is due to the Dalai Lama's influence and also to the philosophies embedded in Tibetan Buddhist culture. fact that Tibetans are prepared to carry out the horrifying act of self-immolation has raised fears among many Tibetans for the future development of the struggle inside Tibet. The time to save lives is now, wrote a group of young educated Tibetans from eastern Tibet in a letter received by the International Campaign for Tibet. Until our generation, our religion has come from Tibet, has thrived in our land, giving a strong sense of moral values, of compassion. We are the first generation who have no access to that. We are frightened for a generation growing up without that. We need His Holiness to teach us forgiveness. If something happened to His Holiness and he was not able to go back home and we were not able to see him, then we cannot tell you what will happen. We fear for that very deeply. Although we do not know the last words of every Tibetan who has self-immolated, we know that virtually all of them have communicated a wish for the Dalai Lama to return to Tibet. The self-immolations in Tibet, a deeply religious culture, raise disturbing questions. Many Tibetan exile leaders have called for their brothers and sisters in Tibet not to take their precious lives. But while controversial, the most widespread response to these acts within Tibet is ultimately one of respect and compassion. On March 16, 2011, a 20-year-old monk called Pinsok drank kerosene, walked out of his monastery, Kirti, in Ngaba, and set himself on fire. A Tibetan friend of his said, Pinsok was a simple and quiet student in the monastery, and after a prayer service at Kirti that day, he prepared for his action. He folded his robes and left them neatly in his room in such a way that clearly expressed he was not going to return for a while. Pinsok died in the early hours of the next morning. Among his last words were a wish that Tibetans should link together like prayer beads on a string. Pinsok's cremation became a focus of a shared grief, as well as an assertion of Tibetan religious identity. This remarkable footage of his cremation, held in defiance of an intense crackdown, is indicative of a new political moment in Tibet, a moment when ordinary people seek to transcend terror through peaceful action, endurance, and solidarity. Since then, there have been gatherings of thousands of Tibetans in different areas of the plateau to pay respects to those who have set themselves on fire and to protest Chinese policies. All sectors of society, students, farmers, monks, nomads, teachers, children, have come together to make reasonable and measured demands for change. Thousands of Tibetans gathered on a hillside during a thunderstorm and prayed until the early hours of the morning at the cremation of Rikyo, a mother of 3 young children, who set fire to herself and died in Zamthang, Ngaba, on May 30th, 2012. Local people created a shrine with burning candles outside the People's Armed Police Base in Chensa, Amdo, where Tamtin Thar set himself on fire on June 15, 2012. Tibetans faced down armed paramilitary police to protect the body of Dorji Rinchen, who set himself on fire and died in Labrang on October 23, 2012. Following 7 self-immolations in 1 week, students at Qinghai University held a vigil in solidarity with the self-immolators on November 9, 2012. Thousands of school children and students marched peacefully through Repkong in Amdo on the same day, gathering later to chant long life prayers for the Dalai Lama. The sadness of living is more painful than death. Unbearable sorrow turned you all into glowing red skeletons. The mouth quivers with flames. The hands are pierced with flames. Flames burn in the breast. Rosary beads of fire scatter to the ground. Look at the smoke rising from the monastery's golden roof. Look at the doors of each monk's cell. In every moment after a storm bursts on one grassland, another storm bursts on the other grassland, following the direction of the wind. Dark shadows move accordingly. The new political moment is evident beyond the responses of Tibetans to the self-immolations. A younger generation of Tibetans is developing new strategies and modes of expression to counter the painful silence of censorship and political repression. Artists create abstract paintings that employ Tibetan motifs in unconventional ways. Rap and hip-hop songs make metaphorical allusions to the Dalai Lama or the young Karmapa in exile. Pure language, virtual and real communities are created to protect the Tibetan language. The wisdom of the Buddha Dharma is shared in microblogs. Just as Beijing seeks to enforce a police state across Tibet, Tibetans are daring to challenge the official state narrative. In doing so, they present a more complex challenge to the Chinese Communist Party leadership than before. A Tibetan blogger writes, "Tibetans are no longer just trying to fit into the Chinese national story. Instead, they are creating their own. It is a new cultural moment. Young Tibetans are starting to have the chance to be many things and at the same time still be Tibetan." In the words of the popular hip-hop collective Yunduk from Amdo, "As I said what I wanted to say, I didn't turn into a mute. Our story has not ended here, it's just the beginning."
So between February 2009 and today, 89 Tibetans have self-immolated in Tibet, including a 19-year-old female student. Oh, sorry. I'm just going to pause that. Is there any way I can stop them from running. So the self-immolators include a 19-year-old female student, grandfather of an important reincarnate Lama, a widowed mother of 4. Thank you. And this is Tape, who was the first Tibetan to set fire to himself in Tibet in February 2009. This is Dolkar So, in August. And this is a very powerful picture of Jamyang Palden from Redkong in Amdo, who survived his self-immolation and was treated in hospital briefly before he died quite recently. And this is Tamdin Dolma, who set fire to herself on November the 15th and died. Tibetans had feared that there would be more self-immolations at the time of the Communist Party Congress, indicating an intention by Tibetans to make a powerful statement to the Chinese leadership at a time of transition. And their fears were realised when there were 5 self-immolations on the eve of the party congress on November the 8th, and then the highest in one day since the self-immolations began. And this pattern of intensity continued, with 15 Tibetans setting fire to themselves between November the 7th and November the 20th. And on the opening day of the party congress on November the 8th, several security guards inside the Great Hall of the People in Beijing held fire extinguishers, while outside on Tiananmen Square, firefighters stood to attention. A 26-year-old mother of 2, Chagmo Ki, who self-immolated and died on November the 17th, left notes written in Chinese and Tibetan calling for the new leader, Xi Jinping, to meet with the Dalai Lama. She had written the word peace on the letter. These are police with fire extinguishers patrolling Lhasa, which is a common sight nowadays. The self-immolations are occurring with increasing frequency, and there has been a broader geographical spread, with clusters of self-immolations in particular areas, often where protest has occurred before, such as Rebkong in Qinghai, Labrang in Gansu, and Naba in Sichuan. This constitutes one of the biggest waves of self-immolation as political protest globally in the past 60 years. And this picture is Dundup in his 60s, who set fire to himself a few weeks ago just outside Labrang Monastery. And he was believed to have, before he died, spoken a lot to young people to say that, in his view, if there was a need to make this ultimate form of sacrifice, then he felt it should be older people who do this, not young people. There was a very powerful article published in Pakistan recently by a journalist called Ajaz Ashraf, and I'm sure that as a result the newspaper had a reprimand from Beijing, and it was a very perceptive article from an Asian perspective. He said, through self-immolation, the Tibetans are symbolically saying that because of the Chinese repression and the Dalai Lama's exile, they are as alive as a dead body waiting to be cremated. Thus, in setting their bodies on fire, they are literally cremating themselves, and also mocking their tormentors who, unable to establish supremacy over their hearts and minds, forever seek to control their bodies and their lives. While the self-immolations are deeply controversial, the overwhelming response from Tibetans to the individuals who self-immolate is one of respect and compassion. The authorities' attempts to turn people against them have been a resounding failure. The self-immolations during the party congress were followed by spontaneous gatherings of thousands of Tibetans in the eastern Tibetan area of Amdo, specifically in Rebkong, to mark the deaths of the Tibetans who had set themselves on fire, and in peaceful protest and vigils. And as you saw on the video, All sectors of society, teachers, school children, farmers, monks, nomads, came together to make reasonable and measured demands for change. And this is a scene of monks praying for Dundup after he self-immolated in Labrang. And this picture you saw in the video, it's a gathering of university students in Shening to hold a vigil praying for the Tibetans who have self-immolated. And these are the school children who demonstrated in Rebkong a few weeks ago. Just a few days ago in Chabcha in Amdo, a gathering of thousands of Tibetan students and school children was broken up violently by police. A number of the children are in hospital, and there are fears for many more arrests and detentions. At the moment, we've just heard 2 days ago that more than 60 people in different areas of Tibet are fasting and praying in solidarity with the self-immolators. So the responses by the Tibetans indicate the significance of the actions of Tibetans as statements, and also the developing sense of Tibetan solidarity and unity across Tibetan areas. The impact of the self-immolations has been beyond measure, a young Tibetan said to me recently. Protests that swept across the Tibetan plateau in March 2008 were met by a brutal crackdown. It's different in scope, objectives and tactics to the repression before 2008. And this crackdown has deepened still further since the immolations began. At the same time, we can discern an alternate narrative of cultural resilience taking shape in Tibet as Tibetans take steps, increasingly bold steps, to defend the core values of their culture. And this is a very important development for Tibet's future as well as China's. While the Chinese government has sought to downplay the self-immolations, they do expose a crisis in the Beijing leadership's Tibet policy. The self-immolations are a dramatic counter to the claims of the Chinese Communist Party to be improving Tibetan lives, and they also are a direct challenge to the CCP's legitimacy in Tibet. The Chinese government has responded to the self-immolations by intensifying the military build-up and by strengthening the very policies and approaches that are the root cause of the acts, such as aggressive campaigns against loyalty to the Dalai Lama. The feared erosion of their authority and their leadership also leads to retributive actions against families and relatives or monasteries associated with those who have self-immolated, which creates a vicious spiral in which more people are prepared to self-immolate because of the oppressive conditions. And although the Chinese government has, of course, sought to blame the Dalai Lama and outside forces for the self-immolations, it's acknowledged by the international community, as well as a growing number of Chinese scholars, Chinese netizens, that these dramatic developments reflect a significant failure of policy that needs to be addressed. Wang Lishong, who is one of the most prominent Chinese writers and scholars to raise the issue of Tibet very openly in China, has argued that one of the fundamental mistakes of the Chinese Communist Party is the attitude to religion. And he writes the following: laws and police power are actually less effective than religion in creating social stability because they only act as a negative deterrent and operate through the principle of punishment. They do not produce or promote goodness in society. China currently has millions of policemen and national guards, not to mention all kinds of joint forces for national security and neighbourhood protection. But crime rates continue to rise, and the annual budget for fighting crime continues to rise too. If police power and laws are the only way to achieve stability, then what check is there on police and government actions in turn? The restraints provided by religion and morality are necessary alongside physical policing. It is a mistake to treat religion as the enemy. China is making such a mistake. To give a vivid example of this counterproductive nature of Chinese policies, in Rebkong, Qinghai, two Tibetans called Nyangchak Tashi and Nyangchak Bum set fire to themselves on November the 12th. Their self-immolation directly followed a visit of officials who were telling people not to self-immolate and who were also warning Tibetans not to keep photographs of the Dalai Lama. Their self-immolations happened within hours of the official visits. 23-year-old Tamdrin So, who was also from that area, had self-immolated a few days before on November the 7th, and she left a letter behind to her father saying, "Father, being a Tibetan is so difficult. We can't even say our prayers to the Dalai Lama's portrait. We have no freedom at all." The Chinese Communist Party continues to prioritize infrastructure construction and resource exploitation as key elements of its strategic objectives in Tibet. They cast Tibetan support for the Dalai Lama and protection of the Tibetan national identity as obstacles to its elaborate ambitions to reshape the Tibetan plateau for its own purposes and to ensure the domination of the Chinese Communist Party. Changes in Chinese laws and regulations have decreased protection of Tibetan language and culture and dramatically eroded the space for the expression of Tibetan identity. So we've witnessed a direct correlation between the self-immolations and an intensified campaign against the Dalai Lama in Tibet, together with the aggressive expansion of legal measures that target Tibetan culture and religion. And this was particularly evident following the increased restrictions in eastern Tibetan areas of Karmananda, where virtually all of the self-immolations have occurred. Whereas before the mid-90s, it was possible often in these areas to openly display pictures of the Dalai Lama, and there was a little space accorded to this. From the mid-1990s onwards, the Chinese authorities launched a particularly aggressive campaign against the Dalai Lama, and this is a picture from 2008 of a defaced picture of a Tibetan Lama in Kirti Monastery in Naba, which is where the self-immolations began. So many Tibetans who have self-immolated have sought to underline the religious context of their acts. Some of them have died with their hands clasped in prayer, while many of them who have self-immolated have done so in front of a monastery or nunnery. This is a picture of a Tibetan white blessing scarf left after one of the self-immolations had taken place. Virtually all of the Tibetans who have self-immolated have communicated a wish for the Dalai Lama to return to Tibet. In Tibetan culture, when a person dies, it is traditional to leave the body as undisturbed as possible, while special prayers and ceremonies are held in order to guide the person to a beneficial rebirth. This is one of the reasons why, in a number of cases, Tibetans on the scene of a self-immolation have risked their lives in an attempt to protect the body of the person who has set fire to themselves and to take them to a place of safety, either a monastery or the person's family home, where traditional rituals can be carried out. It compounds the agony for Tibetans when monks are blocked from praying for Tibetans who have died, as they have been in Naba and many other areas. And this is one of an extraordinary set of images that came out of Tibet a couple of weeks ago, on the same day as the self-immolation of Dorji Rinchen, who was a farmer in his 50s in Labrang. And this picture depicts Tibetans attempting in the middle of you can see the smoke still arising from the body, and Tibetans attempting to take the body away and to protect him from the Chinese troops moving in. And they did succeed, and they took him to the family home where monks were able to pray for him. Immediately after the crackdown following the protests across Tibet in 2008, the Chinese authorities accused the Dalai Lama of orchestrating the unrest in Tibet. And these accusations have only become more strident as the self-immolations began. They accompanied this accusation with a major campaign across the Tibet Autonomous Region to oppose the Dalai Lama, implemented at every level, from the top down to the grassroots. And the authorities' actions after 2008 in doing this must be viewed in the context of the Chinese Communist Party's broader anxieties and insecurities in Tibet. Tibet is not only regarded as a core issue of the PRC's territorial sovereignty, but it's also regarded as a matter of national security. So the stakes are very high. In this new war against successionist sabotage, as the Chinese authorities frame the struggle in Tibet, the Chinese government is seeking to literally replace loyalty to the Dalai Lama in Tibetan hearts and minds with allegiance to the Chinese party state. The Chinese authorities are literally seeking to obliterate memory, in the words of the Tibetan poet Tuosa, and undermine Tibetan national identity at its roots. Political education has reached a new stage and it has a deeper reach. We interviewed a former official who had been carrying out re-education in Tibet when they were in exile some time ago. And this official said this: the Chinese authorities are looking carefully into what Tibetans are thinking, really thinking about their future, and what are the core motivations and reasons for political problems such as the March 14th riot, which was shocking evidence of being far from a harmonious society. And the official said that the Chinese authorities had realized that without completely controlling Tibetans' thinking and what he characterized as the consciousness sphere, the mission of achieving long-term political stability in Tibet is impossible. This is an image from the Chinese official press in Tibet, and it shows farmers harvesting the land, and you can see the red flags, which usually they would carry in traditional Tibet. They would have carried tankers or Tibetan symbols, but now it's the red flag. And this is also an interesting image from earlier this year from the Tibetan press. And you can see Tibetans in traditional clothes, and they're carrying butter sculptures. What they would usually have is a Tibetan religious painting, a tanka. They'd usually be carrying that, or an icon, and instead it's a picture of the four leaders there of Deng Mao, Jiang Zemin, and of course Hu Jintao. And these sort of images have been widespread in the Tibetan media, particularly in central Tibet, the Tibet Autonomous Region, and it's led to some Tibetans characterizing the situation as a second cultural revolution. And another work team member that we interviewed told us this: villagers don't mind too much when we read or teach them the party's policy and how kind the party is, because we have many programs, including singing, games, and competitions. But even so, when we ask them questions about Dalai, which is the disrespectful way used by the Chinese to refer to the Dalai Lama, they always hesitate and they seem uncertain about answering. When it comes to the stage of opposing the Dalai, most villagers find it very difficult, and the meetings often become silent at this point. They do not even want to look at us. So there's a deepening sense of separation among Tibetans in Tibet from the Dalai Lama due to both the increased dangers of expressing loyalty to the exiled leader and also the lack of any formal connection between the Dalai Lama, his representatives, and the Chinese authorities in the absence of an official dialogue process. The last round of dialogue between the Dalai Lama's envoys and the authorities in Beijing took place in January 2010, and that's the longest period of time without a formal meeting since this round of dialogue began in 2002. So research on self-immolation indicates that unlike those who volunteer for suicide attacks, individuals who self-immolate have not generally sought to encourage others to do the same. Jan Palach, who set himself alight in 1969 to protest against the Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia, said from his hospital bed, "My act has fulfilled its purpose, but let no one else do it." Similarly, Tibetans who have left testimonies or notes behind to be found after their self-immolation have in general not called for other Tibetans to carry out those acts. Mostly their communication has been addressed to fellow Tibetans, as opposed to the Chinese authorities or the international community. And often they call for life-affirming actions of protecting Tibetan cultural identity and connecting to each other as a way of determining their own destiny. The young Kirti monk Phuntsog, who self-immolated on March 16, 2011, told fellow monks while he was dying, "My last message for the 6 million Tibetans is to unite, like malas, which are prayer beads on a string, linking every Tibetan. Tibetan people should work together for the cause as much as they can." Self-immolation as a form of protest is a dramatic and powerful statement, but it does not involve the death of others. Despite facing oppression, dispossession, and policies that undermine Tibetan religion and culture in the past half-century, in the main, Tibetans have not turned to violence. This is due to the Dalai Lama's influence and also due to the philosophies embedded in Tibetan Buddhist culture. The self-immolations can arguably be characterized as a rejection of terrorism in accordance with core values of their cultural identity. And as we saw in the film, at the same time, the fact that so many Tibetans are prepared to carry out this agonizing act has raised fears among many Tibetans for the future struggle inside Tibet. A fundamentally new approach is warranted in Tibet. A group of Chinese in the last few days have signed a petition which has been circulated on social media, including Chinese scholars within China. And one of the things that they say about the self-immolations is that they want governments worldwide to make the crisis of self-immolations in Tibet an urgent international issue, to be addressed in all official exchanges between a country or organisation and China. So we believe that governments in the international community should coordinate their efforts with other like-minded countries and explicitly call upon the Chinese government to address the policies in Tibet that threaten Tibetan culture, religion, identity, and these are at the root cause of the current crisis. Scholars have noted that undermining and destroying a sophisticated religious culture based on strong moral values and on compassion only risks long-term instability and conflict. And we also believe that a new approach is warranted for another reason too. Tibet is the world's highest and largest plateau. It's of increasing geopolitical significance. It's a strategic location in Asia, which has the world's fastest growing economies, fastest rising military expenditures, and fiercest competition for resources. Tibet has the largest reservoir of fresh water on Earth and is the source of most of Asia's major rivers, supplying water to nearly half the world's population. As such, it needs to be brought back to centre stage. There is a need for the international community to re-evaluate Tibet not only as an issue of profound humanitarian concern, but also as an issue tied to Asian and global security at the centre of Asia's unfolding future. So I'm going to stop there and introduce our next speaker, Namkho. And first of all, we will show a video. So this video has no sound, or it does have sound, but we aren't able to get it because we've downloaded it. This is an official state media video produced in China. And what we're witnessing here is the first and most elaborate response by the Chinese authorities to the self-immolations. This is a video that was screened in China in May this year. So it took several years for there to be an official response. And you'll see the reason that we're showing this video in a moment. But this is the Chinese spin, if you like, on the self-immolations. And what they're talking about here is they're talking about the dangerous splitists who brought out information about the self-immolations and who courageously showed this in the international press. What we're witnessing in Tibet right now is that people who provide footage, photographs, information are penalized very severely by torture, imprisonment, sometimes death. And this, I think you come up in a minute, yeah. So what you're seeing is the Chinese sort of version of how the international community here, this is the Voice of Tibet website, how they reported the news. And what happens in this video is that they directly accuse and name Namkho here for his role in filming some of the protests. And Namkho is going to discuss this in his presentation, but this obviously means that firstly Namkho is speaking publicly here for the first time about this experience. It means that of course it's too dangerous for him ever to go back to Tibet and China. There you go.
Hello everyone, and thank you for coming here today. And my name is Namkho, and I come from Ngaba area of Tibet. And I left in Tibet 2000, and I'm living in Zurich in Switzerland now. What you are looking at was featured in Chinese state media documentary, broadcast in May. This video was the most elaborated response by the Chinese government to the self-immolations. It still took the Chinese authorities 3 years from the first self-immolation in February 2009 to make this broadcast. And I heard it was aimed mainly at foreign audience, and copies might even have been distributed in Geneva to diplomats elsewhere. In China itself, it was shown at 2 in the morning. Most Tibetans in Tibet I spoke to have never seen it. So this indicates an uncertainty about the official response. So why was I in this propaganda video? In the video, the Chinese say that I am a separatist who was sent to Tibet by the Tibetan government in exile and the Dalai Lama. They said that I took a video in Napa, Tibet, and then took it out out of Tibet. By doing this, the Chinese authorities effectively broke my silence. Before this video, I was able to travel back and further to Tibet very quietly to see my family. I am from Ngaba, which is the area where most of the self-immolations have taken place. Before I traveled to Tibet in the last few years, I had no plan to do anything that could be defined as separatist. I wanted to see my family, of course, and of course I'm a Tibetan and I'm proud to be Tibetan, and I'm very deeply distressed by this level of oppression in Tibet. But when I was in Tibet in March 2011, on the 3rd anniversary of brutal crackdown of a protest in 2008, I found that what I witnessed was unbearable. I started shooting some film in the hope that when I got home, people in the outside world might see it and might know what is happening in Tibet. I wanted to show people who care about human rights, about the true situation in Tibet. China has effectively sealed off the Tibetan plateau. It is not possible for United Nations delegations to go into Tibet independently to witness what is happening. China blocks journalists and Westerners from going to my home area, Ngaba. I thought I could provide evidence through my footage of the situation. This is my motivation. The first self-immolation in Tibet happened in Napa in February 2009. This was Tepi, a Kurd monk from Napa. After that, an intense lockdown was imposed in Napa. I was in Napa at the end of a 7-month visit to Tibet in March 2011. On the anniversary of the March 16 uprising in 2008, when at least 18 Tibetans were killed after protesting against Chinese rule, the atmosphere in the streets of Napa town was quieter than usual, and the police were everywhere, but most not in uniform, but in civil clothes. The purpose was presumably not to trigger any sort of adverse response among Tibetans. At around 3:30 in the afternoon, I was having a cup of tea and a coffee when I got a call from a friend. He told me that there was a problem and I should go home immediately. I left the coffee, but I couldn't get home. There were too many armed police and every road was blocked. When I heard that a monk had self-immolated, a 20-year-old monk called Punso had drunk kerosene, walked out of his monastery courtyard and set himself on fire. I heard later that Punso had prepared for his action after prayers. He folded his rubbish and left them neatly in his room in such a way that clearly expressed he was not going to return for a while. Well, I do not know exactly what went on in Punso's mind when he set fire to himself. I think I can understand something of his anguish, his feelings. As Tibetans have no recourse to express ourselves. This is why Tibetans are taking this step. Every Tibetan in Napa across Tibet feels very deeply about the oppressive Chinese policies, and every Tibetan wants to do something to protect their culture and their religious identity. We are also waiting, hoping for His Holiness to come home. It is also important for you to understand that Tibetans are seeking to follow His Holiness the path of non-violence. The Chinese says that self-immolation is a terrorist act, but it is not. It is an act that emerges from deep pain and suffering, and it is deliberately not taking any other life. It would be more accurate to say it is rejection of terrorism. After so many years of oppression, Tibetans are not taking up arms or try to kill Chinese. I'm also worried, however, that if the situation inside Tibet does not change, and if His Holiness is not allowed to go home, Tibetans may turn to violence in the future. I did not witness Punso's self-immolation, but right after having tea in the coffee, I went into the streets and sought to film what I saw. It was very dangerous. I do not think it is an exaggeration to say that if I had been caught, I could have been killed. I captured some of the footage you have seen today of armed troops on the streets. I witnessed a protest by Tibetans after the self-immolations, and Tibetans been taken into detention. And 2 days later, I witnessed something remarkable which I will never forget. On March 19, Punso was cremated on a hillside near Kurta Monastery. It seemed to me that Punso's cremation became a focus for Tibetan people's grief and the sense of loss, as well as an expression of their solidarity and strength as Tibetan. I filmed about 1,000 Tibetans converged on the hillside. Monks and the lay people did bori kataks. Tibetans white blazing scarf, the nose of their chanting the mantra dedicated to His Holiness rung in their ears, in my ears. There were mothers carrying children. There were old men walking with a stick. People were crying. They were sharing their sorrow. It was as if there was nothing else for them to do. It felt as though my heart was breaking. Ever since then, I have not been the same person. To me, the response of the Tibetan people to the self-immolations tells us something significant. It tells us about a particular moment in Tibet, a moment when ordinary people are coming together to protect what is most precious to them. There may be unbearable oppression, but as one young Tibetan said to me, who can say with any certainty that there is no hope? The Chinese says I am a separatist because I filmed these things. I have told you why I did this and what is meant to me. Of course, the Chinese will be angry with anything that is different to their lives. When I was in Tibet, I traveled to many places. I did not only stay in Napa, I traveled all over eastern Tibet and I spoke to many people, and not only Tibetans, Chinese too. Many Chinese are sympathetic to us. Some of them who have shops in Napa have even shot those shops as a mark of respect when a self-immolation has happened. I felt that if I can at least bear witness and let the outside world to know, understand what is going on in Tibet. It is deeply important for Tibetans that the Chinese do not tell their story. Tibetans want to tell their own story. They want to know the reality. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak here today. Thank you.